Hello and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by CIPS in partnership with Hays. This is a preview of our UK 2023 CIPS Salary Guide, which we are launching on the 10th of July. So you've got a sneak preview today. My name is Danielle Goodrick and I am the Senior Knowledge and Learning Development Manager for CIPS. And I'm joined today by some fantastic industry experts who are here to share their views on some of the topics that we're going to cover today. Firstly, I'd like to introduce CIPS CEO, Nick Welby. Nick, hi. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Could you just introduce yourself a little bit to those who don't know you?
Of course. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Nick Welby, and I'm the CEO of CIPS. For those that don't know me, I'm actually a 30-year career veteran in procurement, working across a number of sectors, including automotive, pharma, and FMCG. And as well as procurement, I've also run GBS functions and had oversight of global IT functions, particularly as we look about collaboration within the function. It's given me a valuable set of experiences that hopefully I can bring to life some of that today, Danielle.
Great, thanks, Nick. And I'd like to introduce now, we've got Nikki Archer, who's Head of the Profession for Scottish Government. Nikki, would you be able to tell us a little bit about your role?
Yes, of course. I think I beat Nick by 3 years. I've been in public and private sector procurement for 33 years, pretty evenly split. And currently I'm accountable for maintaining a framework of procurement legislation and policy for Scotland to ensure that we're using procurement to really boost sustainable and inclusive economic growth. I set the procurement and commercial standards for Scotland and lead our national professionalisation strategy. So attracting, developing and retaining talent is high up my priority list.
Thank you for joining us today. Great to have you here. Scott, I'd like to move on to you. Scott is our the UK and Ireland Engagement Director for Procurement, Logistics and Supply Chain at Hays. Tongue twister there for me, Scott. Could you briefly introduce yourself for anyone who doesn't know you?
Thanks, Danielle. Yes, I've been at Hays for 21 years, which is a long time in recruitment, so they say. My role at Hays is I look after our recruitment, logistics and supply chain divisions across the UK and Ireland, making sure that our recruiters are experts in the field and they place procurement professionals across the UK and Ireland. I also support some of our regions like America and Germany. Part of my role is going into our customers to look at how they can recruit talent in a better way. That's me.
Thanks, Scott. Most of you will know Scott because we've collaborated with Hays for 9 years now. So great to have you here again today, Scott, and all your insights I'm sure will be well received. And finally, but not least, we've got John Glen, who's CIPS economist. John, can you just explain a little bit more about what you do and working with CIPS?
So when working with CIPS, I regularly comment on PMI indices and also factors that impact both supply chain, logistics and procurement industries, sectors, both in the United Kingdom and globally. So I've been working with CIPS now for probably 15 years and I've been involved with this particular engagement with Hays for all of the 9 years that Scott's been involved, I think.
Thank you, John. So just a bit of housekeeping before we go to the panel, and we've got quite a lot of topics to cover today. So our panellists will take your questions at the end, and I'll make sure that we leave enough time for that. But please can I ask that you add them to the comments box? And if you want a question directed to a particular panellist, please add their name in as well, and that will just help me direct that to you. The webinar will be recorded today and you will receive a copy of the recording. For anyone who's attending live, you will also receive a preview copy of the guide ahead of our launch on the 10th of July. If you're watching on demand, you'll be able to access the guide from the 10th of July on the CIPS website. So to open up our panel then, let's get started. John, I'd really like to come to you first, if I may, just to open up the discussion and set the scene for us a little bit. There's a lot been going on over the last year, well, the last few years, but if we talk about the latter year, really, in terms of the economy, what's happened, what we can expect to see in terms of looking ahead and what that impact on the profession may be. If I can hand over to you to talk us through some things there.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we could just put my first slide up and I'll talk to that. An attempt to take us through where we are as an economy, what we're doing about the situation that we find ourselves in, and then what are the implications going forward. So if we look at the figures for the UK economy as produced by the UK Treasury on June the 21st this year, essentially what the Treasury does is it takes the forecasts of 40 independent forecasters, then aggregates them together to develop this picture of where the UK economy is going to be at the end of 2023. So the prediction for growth is that we're going to bubble along or bounce along the bottom. So everybody's talking about whether or not the Bank of England is going to drive us into recession. It looks as if what we're actually going to get towards the end of this year is a situation where growth is relatively insipid. Okay, there's almost no growth in the economy, but what we're not seeing is a deep, what I would call V-shaped recession, similar to that which we got during the initial stages of COVID, and for those of you who can remember back to the financial crisis of 2008. The figure that everyone's obviously talking about is inflation, and the expectation is that inflation at the end of this year will be 4.7%. At the moment, inflation seems to be sticking at 8.7%, and I'll talk about the factors that are driving that at the moment. But we have to differentiate between what's called the CPI, which is the headline rate of inflation, and then people would heard both the Bank of England and the Chancellor talking about core inflation. And core inflation is the inflation that exists when you take fuel and food prices out of the calculation and you see what's left. And the problem we've got at the moment is core inflation is actually increasing slightly and is being a bit difficult to remove. It's been rather stubborn in terms of the reaction that core inflation has got to the Bank of England's increase in interest rates. Okay, as we can see, unemployment at the end of this year is thought to be around 4.1%, and that's a perverse place that we find ourselves in. The UK economy, despite the fact that we're trying to reduce growth, we're almost driving the economy into recession, is at exceptionally high levels of employment. And I know Scott will talk about the specific impacts of that for our sector later, but generally across the economy, employment markets are very, very tight. There is not much headroom in terms of your ability to attract new workers, to attract talented workers, and therefore we're seeing average wages increasing in both the public sector and the private sector at relatively robust rates. So we've got a situation where the UK economy is fully employed, and obviously we've seen post-COVID a number of workers exiting the labour market, deciding not to go back to work. I personally think that that's due to the fact that we have workers who are still part of the defined benefit pension schemes who are deciding it's time to take those benefits and exit. And I think that effect will probably diminish over the next 5 to 10 years. And then we've obviously seen the impact of Brexit on the labour market and our inability to backfill that. So if we go on to the next slide then, what's driving inflation? The most recent CPI figures suggested the real contributors to keeping inflation at 8.7% on the upside were European air travel. And for any of you, including myself, who've been traveling in Europe recently, you'll find that there's a lack of capacity. The airlines are full. Okay, I think the airlines are deliberately constraining capacity, and the price of that travel has increased almost exponentially. So the period of low cost flying in Europe is well and truly over for the moment. Second-hand cars have increased in price, and this obviously reflects the lack of supply or problems in supplying new cars, and therefore you're not getting those second-hand cars coming into the market. And then we see recreational and cultural goods and services as we start to spend those surpluses that those of us who enjoy relatively high levels of income accumulated during COVID. And then, as I said before, we've got core inflation, which actually rose from 7.1 to 6.8% in June of the 8.7. So what you're actually seeing is the impact of increase in fuel prices because of the war in Ukraine, be that gas and or oil, increase in food prices starting to come out of the figures, quite aggressively. But then it's that core inflation that's left behind. And this is what the Bank of England are concerned about, and hence their increase in interest rates. So if we move on then, what we are in for is a relatively tough ride. Everybody's talking about this mortgage time bomb, the fact that the increase in interest rates, as people start to come off their fixed rates, they'll move on to variable rates, which are at significantly higher levels than anything they've been able to fix at over the last 3 to 4 years. Okay, and therefore people are seeing significant increases in their mortgage payments. This will obviously then reduce demand in the economy, and as we reduce demand in the economy, that will bring core inflation down. The problem is that we may cause a crisis in the housing market. There will undoubtedly be some people who, when their mortgage rates increase, are not able to afford the increased payments, and therefore are going to have to sell their houses. And so we could see a significant reduction in house prices as well. So the problem that the Bank of England has is it only really has this one tool, increase in interest rates. It's a very, it's an unsophisticated, quite a brutal tool, and therefore there's a danger that they create significant collateral damage in the economy. We need to be a little bit more sophisticated in the way in which we think about how we control prices going forward. So some of the alternative options I've provided, those of you who can remember the 1970s, and I realise that's a diminishing number of us now, the prices and incomes policy at the end of the 1970s was incredibly effective. So an agreement between unions and the government and corporations, on one hand, to control the rate at which prices were increases, and then unions agreed to control the rate at which wages went up. That sort of tripartite approach is not available now. We could increase taxation to take demand out of the economy, but that's politically not acceptable. We could increase the freedom of movement of workers, potentially within the European Union, or reduce any barriers to immigration, and that would increase the supply of labour. We could reduce red tape on imports, okay? And also we've seen this idea, which Rishi Sunak was mooting over the weekend, around increasing education and training so that we could get more doctors and more nurses, and therefore we became less dependent upon immigrant labour. Now, the issue there, of course, is that that's a long-term policy, and also increasing education and training has the impact of potentially increasing productivity. So there are alternatives, but some of those alternatives are not available to us in the short term because they're longer-term impacts, or are not available to us for political reasons. So going forward then, what are the sunlit uplands? Well, those of you who've listened to me in the past, and apologies if I keep repeating myself, my view is that going forward, before we're very much older, and I think pretty soon after the next election, I would expect to see a trade agreement with the European Union, which facilitated much freer trade with the European Union. The price of that would be freedom of movement of labour within Europe and within the United Kingdom. And I think British industry would be behind that 100%. I think the lack of freedom of movement has constrained our industries, both manufacturing and services, in recent years. I think the big political stumbling block would be the European Court of Justice, the third element that I've got on there. But I think that that would actually be beyond people's interests. I don't think it would be as big an issue as it was in the referendum in 2016. And post the referendum, I think it would be something that would be fudged in the background and would be a price that people were willing to pay for freedom of movement of goods and services and freedom of movement of people. And I hope that will happen. I don't hope, I kind of expect that it will happen maybe a bit sooner than some politicians and political commentators are suggesting. So you may wish to ask me some questions about that later. So I think that is me finished.
Thank you, John.
Danielle.
Thank you for that wonderful insight. Always good to hear from you. I know we all wait with bated breath as to what you're going to say and whether your predictions are going to come true. So let's hope they listen to some of your suggestions and we see a bit of an upturn soon. So I'd like to start and open up the panel discussion now. So we're here today to talk about the salary guide findings for this year. And there's some key themes that we want to touch on that we cover in the guide, because it's much more than just a salary guide. We look at priorities, challenges, opportunities, skills, career development. The list is endless. What employers should be doing and offering. So I'm going to try and tease some of that out of the panel today and get their views and from their experiences, as well as touching on some of the things that we highlight this year. So if I start now by looking at the main priorities that people told us in the survey this year. So two of the main priorities are building supply chain resilience and improving supply chain visibility. And we see that globally, not just in the UK, but we're going to focus on the UK today. So Nick, I'd like to come to you first. Obviously, your private sector background prior to joining CIPS, and I'd really welcome your views to open up as a prior CEO on how these priorities resonated with you and your experiences over the last year.
Yeah, no problem, Danielle. Thank you for that. I don't think it's any surprise that these two come up. I actually think they're intrinsically linked. We've had a lot of black swan events over the last 2 or 3 years with COVID, the canal being blocked by Evergreen, the inflation that John's talked about. A lot of things are actually impacting supply chains, and the resilience of supply chains now are very much linked to having the visibility around what's in your supply chains. It wasn't too many years ago we were looking at, okay, what is our tier 1, what is our tier 2, or what is our tier 3? That's no longer good enough. Very quickly, a supply chain of 5,000 tier 1s becomes 500,000 tier 4s and tier 5s. And that resilience is really driven by having the understanding of where's your failure points. How do you get an understanding of where your supply chains are coming from and to? And actually quite often now, those supply chains are intrinsically linked. Suppliers at the lower levels are supplying from and to each other, and are supplying subcomponents or materials that other suppliers in the supply chains need. So for me, that supply chain resilience is because we've got good supply chain visibility. And I think that's still an area that as a profession, we need to really understand, how do we get that? It's not a competitive issue. These things are often collaborative to try and understand, how do we get the supply chain visibility to be able to make the right decisions? And of course, linked to that, very much now the focus on ESG is coming to the fore. Corporates and organizations need to be able to understand in their supply chains, where are their ESG focuses? Where are the risks that they're running? How do they understand the risk? And therefore, how do they mitigate the risks? So for me, absolutely not a surprise that they're on there, totally intrinsically linked. But I also think they're very much linked to the increasing focus we're seeing on ESG.
Yes, and interestingly, ESG was actually within the top 5. It was 5th priority. So it's right up there, and we saw that across all levels. So yeah, good points there. Thank you very much, Nick. So we've heard your kind of private sector viewpoint. Nikki, I'd like to bring you into the discussion now, if I may, just to gain a public sector perspective, really, if you're able to share your thoughts.
Yes, no bother at all. I mean, delivering quality public sector services at sustainable costs in the inflationary world that was just described is clearly key. So supply chain diversity and resilience is certainly a top priority for us. For us, that also includes driving ethical and fair work standards through the supply chain, including everything from fair pay and conditions and equality considerations to prompt payment, because that keeps a more resilient supply chain. And just staying on the subject of supply chains, opening up supply chains helps us to create more jobs, apprenticeships, training, which helps us to tackle poverty and inequalities in our community, as well as supporting those more diverse supply chains. So, you know, working on more and fair jobs supports economic growth, and that includes everything from facilitating SME and third sector access to our supply chains, and encouraging Scottish manufacturers and inward investors to create their lovely economic footprints in Scotland and the UK, and using our influence to really maximise other community benefits and wealth through procurement. And finally, of course, if we're to have a kind of resilient, future-proof, sustainable supply chain, we're also focused on driving our ambitious climate commitments. So that includes promoting and enabling the supply chains and innovation that we're going to rely on in the future, and making sure we bring people with us on that journey to net zero. So having the right future-proofed skills, capability, capacity is absolutely critical to all of those.
Thank you, Nikki. And obviously touching on what Nikki said, Scott, I'd like to come to you and say what you're hearing from clients, what's their focus, especially around kind of the job side and the skills that people are looking for.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. And yeah, to echo both Nick and Nikki's points, the visibility around supply chains, there's a huge kind of social value element to it as well around the communities. And thankfully, as a supplier ourselves, we're seeing more of our customers looking to partner with us rather than being that transactional supplier. You need something from us, we might need something from you. That's kind of do some form of deal and then move on. It's more around how can we support each other moving forward, and that could be kind of sustainability related. It could be social value. So that's really good. And then going kind of towards the job front and the skills that are needed, these types of people are going to be needed around what does that look like. We all know, and Nick mentioned earlier, that often when you're looking at supply rationalization or visibility or you're auditing, it's normally the top tier suppliers, but the bottom tier suppliers often get forgotten about because often there isn't enough time. So we're seeing a lot more jobs created in the supplier relationship management space now that can actually manage end-to-end supply chains to make sure that there is visibility in the first place, but then actually how can you maximize your opportunities with each other to make not only the world a better place, but also to create some more jobs as well.
Thank you. And that just shows the more kind of active approach, doesn't it, in terms of being proactive with that element. Thank you. So I just wanted to raise the point, we've actually launched a supply chain visibility survey yesterday, so quite good timing. This has gone out to all our members, so you may have seen it, but you will get a link to the survey on the follow-up to this webinar as well. So we'd really encourage people to take part in it. It will help us see where people are in terms of their visibility, but also enable us to make suggestions for the future. So we're running that piece of research with Warwick University, so look out for the survey link. Okay, I'd like to move on to the perception of procurement now, which is another positive one. Great to see this. Again, this year, the perception shift is showing a healthy majority. 63% of professionals feel the perception's improved over the last year. And given the challenges we've talked about and John's alluded to, and the challenges we face going forward, that's really, really positive and all encouraging. And we're seeing 69% of directors and heads of understanding what procurement professionals have to offer. And when we think about this, we're talking about what Nick said in terms of ESG, supply chain visibility, and those real kind of strategic objectives. So that's great. So I'd like to talk about how these stats resonate with the panel a little bit more and what can be done to keep up the momentum. Nick, can I come to you first?
Sure. And I guess having just stepped out recently of being a CPO in a FTSE, it absolutely resonates with me. The conversations and the perception of procurement, given the events of the last 3 years, was definitely at a premium. We were the window to the external world. So whether it's from a corporate responsibility through ESG, whether it's through ethical sourcing, whether it's through managing inflation, whether it's ensuring the supply chains are working, the conversations were much more strategic than they had been. So that's a real positive. And I think the flip to that is the perception that 69% of directors of other departments have about procurement. Suddenly procurement had information at a level that it didn't have before. It was that window to the external world, where whether it was the ESG director wanting to understand transparency in the supply chains, whether it was factory directors wanting to understand what were the supplier health like. And we've seen a number of suppliers down the supply chains, as Scott said, where we due to COVID, due to financial constraints, suppliers go out of business. So you had to be much more proactive of having your finger on the pulse. That meant that you became much more part of the conversation. Now, I think for moving forwards, what will keep the momentum is bringing the insights around the supply chains, being proactive around gaining the information, be able to be part of the conversation, and actually broadening that up out of what would be traditional procurement and supply chain into that broader business perspective.
Thank you, Nick. And Scott, what would your thoughts be? What are you kind of hearing from obviously being in the market, talking to employers and what they're looking for? What's the difference? How's it changed?
Yeah, good question. I think also to back Nick's point up, I think I quite like the fact that we're talking about being involved in the conversation. There's often this hell-bent thing around, I want to be in the top table, I want to be at the board meetings. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to be there, because actually a lot of those meetings are quite boring and it's very ops focused. You want to be going to the meetings to deliver and show value and core value. And I think the key thing around this is gaining momentum is around the storytelling and how you are becoming a valued part of that organization. So what are you bringing to the table that others can't? So for example, not just bringing data, but bringing the right data to the right types of audiences that are going to actually be able to influence and help you influence change within the organization. That's really key. You can't just keep putting your hand up saying, I want to be at the top table. Can we be there? We're procurement. This is what we can do for you. It's what is it you're going to do that the other departments can't do? And what's really going to offer value to the business overall? And what does that look like? And how are you going to influence those stakeholders, as well as bringing in supply chain to make a kind of a true partnership across and a collaboration across your stakeholders as well as your suppliers? And that's the real key bit, is around the storytelling and really showing value and making a difference.
Thanks, Scott. That business element and business partner is really, really important. And we'll cover that in terms of some of the skills required to have those conversations and talk the right language at the top table. Okay, so if we now go on to challenges, I want to go into this a little bit more detail, because we highlight in our findings, and we've talked a little bit already, managing risk is really important in the supply chain. And this tops the table again this year. But no surprise, really, given the uncertain times that we've had and things that we've discussed. But this is also followed by volatile markets and tight budget restraints. And these are kind of new entries into the kind of top things that we're citing in the report this year. So with these tight budget restraints and volatile markets, does that mean that projects are maybe put by the wayside, or money is directed into, or time and resources directed into other areas, things like sustainability or investment in talent? Scott, what are your views? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think from a sustainability, not so much, because there are legislations that we've all got to follow and we've all got to push that through. So that's not so much from a budget constraint point of view, although there is an effect on that is because of headcount. So given my role and what I do and what I speak to customers around headcount and people, often the talent budget gets put to the wayside. So whilst an organization may think actually this year to look at our scope 3, for example, and have a real good detail in depth of that this year, I need somebody else, or I need an expert, or I need a contractor, or I need a perm member staff, whoever that may be, that then gets put on hold. And we've seen that quite a lot over the last probably 6 to 8 months, where projects are being put on hold, not necessarily taken away, because they haven't got the people to be able to deliver those projects and programs. And that's kind of the key thing around budget restraints. Now, what we are seeing organizations do with these is actually, can they bring people over that have a different skill set, from a different background, from within the organization? And we're seeing a bit more social mobility moving around, and internal mobility around different skills in different areas, being able to subsidize and substitute for and deliver some of those programs, although not as fast as an expert would do.
Yeah, and I guess it's about that reprioritization, isn't it? And looking at what best meets the needs at that particular time. So, Nikki, can I come to you? So we've heard from Scott, but from a public sector point of view then, how do you manage the budget restraint challenges here in procurement? And does that impact maybe the pressures that are put on the team?
Without a doubt. I mean, we're all operating within ever tightening budgets, and capacity is a major issue across the Scottish public sector. So we're having to strictly prioritise our scarce resources to get the biggest bang for our buck in procurement. So we produced the first public procurement strategy for Scotland and launched it recently in April, just to ensure that we are actually all pulling together completely across the whole of the public sector, and not wasting our scarce resources. And also, we sit at the top table. We provide contributions to Scotland's economic strategy on where procurement can add value. And because we implemented our Procurement Reform Scotland Act in 2014, we're also bound legally to produce an annual report which shows what is the impact of procurement on social, economic and environmental outcomes. Are we doing what we say we're going to do, and where can we improve and do even better? Kind of pushing that continuous improvement cycle. But does it mean we have to put things on hold? We have to delay it without a shadow of a doubt. We have to identify what can hold, what can be done once instead of multiple times. And actually, we fight very hard to retain our professionalisation and capability budgets, because we think that's critical to working more efficiently. So we invest in national tools and systems and templates once, so that everybody can use them, and we have national training and forums to build capability. And we think it's the time not to slow down on investing there.
I bet that's a tough conversation to have sometimes, but very worthwhile. So if we move on to the next big headline then that we report this year, salaries have grown by 7.3%, which is great, considerably more than the 4.9% last year, and we're ahead of the national average at 6.5%. But this is all very positive, but to John's point earlier, is this sustainable, or is it a one-off aligned to some of the market inflation figures that John covered earlier? So how does it look in the context of the economic climate, John, and the cost of living crisis? Oh, you're on mute, John.
In terms of the cost of living crisis, even a 7.9% increase is not covering you for the inflation that we've experienced to date. But it is the case that private sector wages are increasing much greater than public sector wages, and that's kind of what's driving your figures. And it shows the trends that we're observing. It shows a very, very tight labour market. It shows a war for talent that's out there, and the fact that holding on to your very best people is going to be difficult. So we need to think about how we develop those people, how we plan their careers, how we create a sort of inspiring vision for them going forward. So I think the best employers will hold on to people because they'll do that, and they'll make sure that the people are developed in a way which allows them to grow inside the organisation. But I would expect that wage pressure to be there for at least the next 12 months. I wouldn't be surprised if we come back next year and find that wages have increased by a similar amount, if not more.
Yeah, thank you, John. I think a lot of people will be waiting to hear what the percentages are coming out like. So 7.3% does seem quite good, doesn't it? And Scott, what are you seeing in the market around this talent migration and impact on salaries? How do we compare, and what is this translating into some of the placements that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think it's very good to see once again that procurement is being recognised as an industry profession, because once again, I think this is probably 6 years in a row that it's outstripped the statistics for the government, which is fantastic. So it shows an investment into the procurement profession. What we are seeing, though, and probably to John's point earlier on around low unemployment levels, there aren't people readily looking for work. So actually, to attract new people is going to cost you more than the 7% wages. So, you know, the wage increases of those that are in their current jobs, not the people that are looking for jobs. And we're seeing that kind of exponentially grow even more than that, because those people that are looking for work, they know that there aren't that many people that are around and available. So actually that can demand a lot higher salaries than that. And that is a real challenge, especially in the public sector, who can't necessarily compare. And I'm sure Nikki at some stage may back me up on that, but kind of the couple of key buzzwords are kind of in line with what John said is, you know, we're hearing the whole, you know, train and retain, you know, making sure that you are training your current employees, and that could be going through CIPS certifications. And those more senior that have done all their CIPS qualifications and certifications already, is there other further training that can be done? And for those departments that they may not necessarily be able to use their apprenticeship levies because it's used on something else, is actually looking at other areas of procurement that could be of interest. So, for example, could some of your teams that look after supply management sit with a legal team and get some legal training, which is in-house, which doesn't necessarily cost any external money, because actually retraining is going to help you to retain those staff, because to replace them is going to cost a lot more than the 7.9%. And that said, that actually sometimes you still need to buy in expertise, so you don't always have that internally. So it's making sure that when you're working with suppliers like us, or whether you're trying to recruit yourselves, is that you are articulating what it is you need, what skills do you actually need, and being a bit more open-minded than you perhaps traditionally have been.
Thank you. And if we build on that theme then, because attracting and retaining talent is something that comes up every year, and we know it's a struggle, and we see it more than ever this year. It's grown, especially in the public sector, as you mentioned, Scott. So what can be done to attract and retain the right talent? Nikki, can I come to you first? What are you doing in this competitive market to perhaps differentiate yourself if salaries aren't always easy to compete on?
First of all, succession planning is a key issue. So we're taking a number of different approaches to it. I'm very aware I'm not showing up on your video at the moment, never mind. But we've initiated a couple of things. At the entry level, we've created the Procurement People of Tomorrow programme. And that has basically been about creating and launching a range of new academic and vocational pathways into our profession from as far back as 2014 onwards, working with schools, colleges, universities and careers coaches to raise awareness of procurement as a career of choice. So creating that pipeline of supply rather than having people falling into procurement, and then working on the other end with suppliers and with employers to develop that pipeline of demand, creating placement opportunities for young people and career changers, using all of those vocational and academic pathways. And we've really had some success there over the years. And some of those who we brought in the early days are now senior buyers, instrumental in driving procurement through the pandemic and economic shocks. You know, we still, you know, when I look at, we're actually about to appoint our 70th Procurement People of Tomorrow placement next week. You know, that's just one organisation, never mind the whole of the public and private sector. So we still struggle to attract more experienced procurement people at the other end, with a lot of people retiring. So we've got to focus on what we call our career tree. So instead of just encouraging people to move up the ladder, it's about moving from branch to branch, building their knowledge circles, you know, and then, you know, when they go up the tree, up the ladder, they're taking with them not just a license to procure, but a license to procure and drive in the wind and the rain and the snow, with all this lovely breadth and depth of experience that will take them further. So it's creating that learning culture, that learning environment, supported environment, where people can really progress and be supported to do so. So both ends of the spectrum, but it's not easy. It's not easy.
Not easy, but it sounds great what you're doing. I like the idea of the tree and kind of creating the breadth and the depth and the skills that we need, and the skills that people are missing perhaps, or perhaps need to develop, is that kind of breadth. So when we look at the recruitment market then, Scott, the power dynamics kind of shifting a little bit. So aside from salary, people want more things. And I think the shift's moving from employer to employee a little bit more. For example, we've got the demands of hybrid working now. People are expecting that. Truly flexible working, how people are measured based on output rather than time, things like that. How are organisations adapting to these rapidly changing needs to remain maybe an employer of choice? And do you have any examples of good people in the market with their employee value propositions? What are they doing well?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I actually still think that despite hybrid working being kind of normal now, right, we've been doing it for a long time, people are still trying to find their feet on it. What does it look like? You know, there's been some things in the news recently where people are trying to get everyone back into the office. Is that the right thing? No, probably not. But we've had customers speak to us to say, actually, I'm looking for a new role because my role is fully remote and I hate it and I feel lonely and I want to be with people. And I think that procurement's role is actually to be with people. That could be suppliers, stakeholders. Now, I don't mean you need to go to the office every day by all means, but there needs to be some face-to-face collaboration in there. We talk about EVP, so employer value proposition. That is really key. So when companies are trying to hire and they're struggling, what I'd always talk to them about is what is going to get somebody to join your company? What is different to everyone else that's trying to hire out there? For example, looking at job descriptions that have probably been written 10 years ago, you know, is that encouraging a more diverse workforce? So maybe returning to work mums, for example, or ex-military that could possess those skills in procurement, but just don't quite have the understanding of legislation, specifically in the public sector. But can that be taught? Quite possibly. Is it freely available around your kind of social value proposition? People want to know about what do you do for the community? What does your business do for the greater good of the planet, for example? Is that advertised on your website, for example? And often it isn't. Is it on your job description? It often isn't either. It doesn't even come up often in interviews. And then on top of that is then when you finally do get to see somebody and you think actually they're a really good candidate of ours, be mindful that they are probably interviewing with 3 or 4 of your competitors. So again, that hiring manager, when was the last time they had training on how to interview correctly in line with the current market in terms of knowing what the ESG platform looks like and portfolio looks like within your own business, for example, the exact hybrid working policy, not your own thoughts on it, because ultimately, especially in procurement, that person is going to look at that employer contract. And if it doesn't say, actually, I can work from home fully remotely, but I've said that you can, what does that mean? And is there a challenge around that? So making sure that, again, your hiring managers have had appropriate training in line with everything else. Do they know your ED&I agenda and your policy? You know, how diverse is your workforce overall, globally, locally, within your team? They're questions that people will want to know the answers to. So you've got to make sure that you're doing it correctly. And the employers that are doing well, I'm not going to name employers on a call, on a national call, because I don't think that's fair. But the ones that are doing it well have got a good balance of this. No one's got it perfect, because I still think it's work in progress. But it's those organizations that accept that actually it's about the outputs, and everyone has some sort of target, whatever that might be. It might be a value add target, it might be a sales target, it might be a savings target, whatever it could be. So why don't you manage based on that, as opposed to have you sat at your desk from 9 to 5 and have you logged into your Teams call? Or does it say a little yellow dot next to it all the time? And monitoring it differently, because that will also help to attract a different type of person into your organization.
Yeah, very true. And the different skill sets you need for different roles in different organisations and the balance of those. And it's creating that environment where people feel that they can be themselves and thrive and deliver all of those things as well. So some good points there, Scott. Didn't expect you to name anyone, but it's good to know who's doing well. And Nick, what things can organisations do to make sure they're a competitor of choice, perhaps thinking about training needs?
Sure. And I like what Nikki said about the tree and the branch, actually, because what we see a lot of is people want skills pathways. And wherever you are in your career, people want to learn. They want to feel that they're continuing to develop, and that branch, as you grow, you know, your skills become different. You know, the higher up the tree you are, perhaps you need a broader skill set, or you become a specialist, so you need an individual skill set. And actually what we're trying to do at CIPS is ensure that we're a partner for life for people through their careers, so that we can give them skills, we can give them opportunities, we can leverage training for everybody, wherever they are in their career, so that they can continue that development and they can continue that learning. And it often isn't just about a vertical progression, it's about a breadth. It's about acquiring those new skills with an employer, as Scott said, actually nowadays, that probably aligns with your ethical and social values, much more than it perhaps did historically. So I very much see that learning pathway, that ability to continue development, whether that's horizontal, vertical, new skills, is going to be really key for organizations to be able to offer, not only to prospective employees actually, but as Scott outlined earlier on, to retain talent as well is going to be really important. And often it's a much more cost-effective route than trying to hire in.
Yes, and just having those viewpoints on what those is and those opportunities, like you say, Nick. Okay, if we continue along the theme of talent then, I'm conscious of time, but I've got a couple more questions before we open up to the audience. So if anyone does have any more questions, please add them to the chat and I will get through as many at the end. So if we dive a little deeper into skills shortage, then looking at the data, a lack of specific skills is a genuine concern still. We see this year after year, but how's the profession dealing with that and what more can be done? Scott, I'd like to get your viewpoint here.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, that employers need to kind of look at what the skills that they will need in the future to do their jobs, and what does procurement like forward thinking as opposed to right now or historical, which is even worse. A lot of hiring managers look at their own backgrounds and think, oh yeah, I've succeeded in procurement, so that means that I need the same person like me, which is completely the opposite way of thinking. It should be looking at what do we think we're going to need in the future. So for example, things around artificial intelligence, things around data manipulation. Yeah, so we all know now that there are so many different tech platforms and you can pull loads of different data and reams of data, but how is that going to relay back to your stakeholder who might want to know something a little bit different? Your marketing team, if you're buying marketing services, will want to know something completely different data related than if you're dealing with finance. So it's around how you be able to use those soft skills from a communication point of view, but some of the technical skills around where do I find data, how do I manipulate it, how do I do a VLOOKUP to make it relevant for that audience, and so forth. So it's really key around that, as well as backing up some formal training, so some of the CIPS training which you'll need. And as soon as you progress in your career, if you're facing off to a finance director who's no doubt going to be qualified in accountancy in some way, shape or form, if you are not qualified or in your own profession, how are they going to take you that seriously? So it's a real kind of balance between the softer skills which you can develop throughout your career, but having the real core certifications that are going to enable you to get into that room with a peer.
Thanks, Scott. And yeah, we see the value of our CIPS qualifications throughout the report, and the differentials in salaries that people are paid as well. So I'm sure everyone will be quite interested in reading what those are this year, and I won't go into the detail. But there is a genuine standard around CIPS and the qualifications and that credibility that it does give you as a base point to then learn the other skills on top. So, Nick, what more can CIPS do to support then? What other things that can we do?
I think it builds on what Scott said, Danielle. There are some core technical skills you need in any role, and we can offer those as part of the progression pathway. There are also skills that are much more relevant in terms of that collaboration we talked about earlier on now, the ability to talk to your finance directors in a language they understand, the ability to engage with marketing directors who probably don't want to hear about category management, but want to be able to articulate and talk about what they want, becomes increasingly important as we look around the collaboration that's needed to deliver procurement of the future. And therefore, building on the skill sets that you have, both technical and also those softer skills. Also, we talk about the ESG agenda, ensuring that ethics is part of what we do, giving people an understanding that when you have MCIPS, it comes with a certain level of standard that we can all make sure we're proud of, and that our collaborated stakeholders can ensure that they understand what that is. So bringing that rounded skill set, ensuring that we are looking future focused, as Scott said, and building on the new skills that will be needed will be really important for us to stay relevant when we work in our businesses.
Thank you, Nick. That relevance is really important. So we've touched on some of the priorities, we've touched on some of the challenges, some of the how we can attract and retain the talent. So when you've got the talent, when you've got people there and you want to keep them then, I just want to touch on the topic of inclusion before we close this part of the panel discussion really, because we've talked about inclusion quite a bit, but there now needs to be a step change in terms of less talk and more action, we feel, around creating these inclusive workplaces, but more importantly, an inclusive profession. And a true sense of really belonging. So, Nikki, I'd just like to hear from you first. You're doing a lot of work of this in the Scottish Government. So what's your views?
Yeah, it is a major focus for us. And in addition to the Procurement People of Tomorrow programme that I mentioned earlier, where we're trying to address our age balance, if you like, we supported the Scottish Government's launch of their disability recruitment and retention strategy, and we've got our own race action plan within procurement. So we've actually chosen to make use of disability, carer, social mobility, internships to bring people into procurement, give them a chance that they're struggling to get, and supporting them to gain the skills and knowledge to further their careers in procurement. So as a result of that and the Procurement People of Tomorrow programme, we're trying to create a more diverse talent pool from which we can actually draw and then support them as they come in. And as a result, the diversity of our own workforce is changing. We've got a great healthy gender profile, a much healthier age profile. As I said, we're using our programmes to try to address our aspirations on race, disability and social mobility. It's a journey, there's much more to do, and that included training all of our staff on diversity and inclusion and embedding targeted objectives. So not the usual, just, what's the word, you're just talking a good game. It's what's your measurable objective that you're going to deliver to help drive this agenda. So we're very committed to it. We're making progress, but much more to do.
Thank you. Good to hear, Nikki. And we're on a journey as well at CIPS. I mean, we're really keen to understand some of the barriers to progression within the profession, and we've conducted our own research recently, which we'll be launching soon. So, Nick, do you want to share your thoughts on this? Because I know we're keen to understand some of these things so we can put plans in place, don't we, in terms of accessibility of CIPS qualifications, for example?
Absolutely. We know the world is getting more diverse. It's not where we all want it to be. And therefore, we've launched a study to try and capture thoughts around ED&I. And I really like the word belonging as well. How do we create cultures where people feel they can belong, regardless of status, whatever it means in their life? And we will be publishing later on this year our findings around that ED&I study. What are the barriers to progression? How do we ensure that we can give people the right opportunity, regardless of background, regardless of where they're coming from? And we want to make sure we capture those and ensure that we can provide at CIPS the right environments, the right qualifications, the right standards, the right opportunities for people to get into the profession and be part of an exciting future moving forwards.
Thank you, Nick. And we'll let people know when that's launching, probably autumn time. We've just not got a definite date yet. So I'm going to open up to questions to the panel now. We've got quite a few questions come in. So first one, I'll go for Scott. This can go to you. Do you have any advice on what a good employee value proposition should contain? How can you stand out from the crowd?
That is a really good question. Probably I could spend an hour talking about this and doing a deep dive, but I'm not going to. Look, I think it's about re-evaluating what your hiring process looks like at the moment, and when was the last time it was reviewed? Because the customers that I speak to, the last time, again, a job description was reviewed, or their careers website was reviewed, or their hiring managers were trained, was probably well before COVID. And as we all agree, we're in a very different world at the moment. And I spoke to somebody the other day that we're in a very fast-paced environment, right? And change is basically the new norm, a rapid change. So your recruitment processes need to fall in line with the change of the rest of the world and where your organization is going. So you need to look at all those processes, even the way to how people apply. The long, arduous application forms, they are well and truly done now. You'll turn people away if they have to face those. Now, I appreciate in a lot of the public sector, you have to go through those processes, but there's ways that you can engage with the audience to make sure that they're kind of bought into the process without having to kind of blankly canvas something that actually has not even been spoken about just yet.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, there's definitely more work to be done, isn't there? I think in terms of people reviewing what they do and what they can do to move forward. I've got another question which is quite interesting. Nikki, I'd like to pose this to you if that's okay, because I know you do a lot of work in terms of building talent pipelines and with young people coming into the profession. And this was around, this person feels that the profession's quite similar to when they accidentally joined it 20 years ago. So what can we do more to get people from universities and make this more a kind of conscious career of choice?
I mean, you know, we've put in the effort. We didn't get any money to do this programme, so it's about giving back. It is about, you know, those more senior and those who we've been bringing in through the Procurement People of Tomorrow route. They're really enthused and engaged about giving back, and they've only been in 4 years, 5 years. And when we're going to talk to, you know, we engage with local universities, local colleges, and particular courses. So, you know, we've helped to create some procurement and supply chain courses, but I can equally go and talk to business courses, doing the visiting professor thing, going and talking about what it's like in procurement, making it live, talking a language that resonates, you know, talking about the flexibility within our particular profession to really develop your career. So we've developed a schools pack, we've developed a tertiary education pack, trying to make it real. And we've also developed placement packs and a pledge that those who've been in this profession for a while can sign up to and say what they're going to give back. So it gives some ideas about how we can give back. And all of that collateral is open for anyone to use. I've shared it with CIPS, I've shared it with my UK colleagues, my Welsh colleagues, my Northern Ireland colleagues, and anyone on the call. You know, it's just maybe finding a place to put these things, pointing folks to it, use it yourself. Go in and adopt a local school, a local college, a local university, and tell them you're there to help them retain and develop their talent. Better still, if you can identify placements for them, because they're really interested in getting jobs. So can you take a couple of their students or an intern, or offer them some projects to work on, a bit of a win-win? So there's loads of ways to engage, and I'd be happy to share some of that.
That would be great. Thank you, Nikki. Anyone else on the panel? Scott or Nick want to share their thoughts?
I was just going to say, I think that there's a lot of conversations that need to be had with a lot of the careers advisors at colleges or even universities and schools where they may not understand procurement. And what we often do is go and speak to the students, but not the people that are advising the students on a daily basis. So, you know, I think that that's an area that we can look into. There's also things around work experience, and we've done a kind of a collaboration with a couple of companies in London, for example, around bringing in different talent and all going to speak to each other's organisations around procurement and what it looks like, and kind of almost spreading the word. And you think about how many members or how many people we know in procurement, how often do we talk about that to our colleagues, friends? The people on this call, how many of your family members know what procurement is, as an example, given that you do this as your job day in, day out? So it's about spreading the word to the right people.
Yeah, and I would build on both of those, Danielle. Now, I think the profession has moved on tremendously in the last 20 years. The things we get involved in now, just what we talked about in the last hour, the breadth of activities for procurement, the amount of stakeholders that we deal with, the amount of projects that we look after, it really is a very diverse set of activities and a very fulfilling one if we get it right. But I also think giving back, and to both Nikki and Scott's point, ensuring that the next generation understand that it's not just a historic view of perhaps negotiating and category management. We do much more than that. And that really can align with people's social values. It can align with corporate values. Now, we are getting now very much more around the right tables and having the right conversations. And that's a great place for the profession to be.
Yeah, I think Nikki's got her hand up.
Yeah. one last comment, because I know we're short of time. To Scott's point, you're absolutely right. Working with careers advisors, we got all the careers coaches for schools together in one place to take them through what our offering was. And what we found out is, where is the online resources that young people go to identify potential careers? And we've put procurement in there, and we've put case studies in there, so that when they're looking at the job of an engineer or a doctor, they can find about the job of a procurement person. So I think your point is absolutely appropriate. That's what we've done in Scotland, and I think we can do that across, the four regions of the UK.
Yeah, to your point, Nikki, it is that storytelling element a little bit as well, isn't it? Because you need to bring people on the journey and show them the end point and what they can achieve, and capture the magic and imagination of what they could deliver. People want to make a difference in their careers, and this is the perfect place to be. So it's just about kind of creating that awareness and finding what ticks their boxes, and whether it's, I don't know, any industry or public sector or whatever. So I am getting flashes for time, but we have got a couple more questions that I want to touch on. So if people want to hang on a few minutes, I will go through a couple more questions. Someone has actually agreed on 100% remote working not being the way forward, because procurement professionals need more face time with teams and stakeholders. So we need to find a way of making hybrid work so we get the balance of both. Good point. Scott, this is a good one. Are you seeing clients starting to relax requirements on bias towards degrees or having to have worked in XYZ industry to get good candidates into roles? Or are they still carrying vacancies? Or is there more work to do to challenge these requirements to be more inclusive? And I know we're doing some work on this together, Scott, aren't we? So perhaps you can talk on some of that.
There's a few questions in one there, so I'll do my best to answer as many as I possibly can in one hit. Yes, in terms of people being a bit more open-minded in who they recruit and how they recruit people, yes. We still aren't there yet. For example, certain industries will say, I want someone from that industry, and I'm not going to name the industry, so not to offend anybody, but we still see that happening. And that's partly, again, goes back to my point around the training for hiring managers. And I would question what their ED&I policy looks like, and actually how much training have they had versus being unbiased versus conscious bias and unconscious bias, because they're not necessarily being completely consciously biased. It's just that they haven't had enough training to understand that the reason that they need to be kind of, more open-minded is actually train of thought, you get better work done, and all the other benefits that comes with having an inclusive workforce that feel again like they belong. So they're still way off yet. There's also the challenges around the hybrid working and what does that look like. So it's very easy to have a conversation with a team, and from a belonging point of view, if everyone is in the same room or if everyone's on a Teams call, generally speaking. But what about those that are in the office and some are on a Teams call, and how are you interacting with those, and how are you making sure that your conversation is inclusive? Because we all know that as soon as we clock off and say bye-bye, the people in the room are going to ask other questions. And do you answer them? Do you not answer them? It's a really tricky conversations to have. But yeah, there's lots of work to be done. And again, it's a lot of it is around the EVP at the beginning, from the beginning part of the recruitment process, and then all the way through. And then when these people join and start on the first day, they are made to feel welcome. You even tell them around why you hired them. That often gets forgotten. So somebody turns up on the first day, they get to do the job. They don't necessarily feel like, not many people like change. So they get into their new role and they're not sure about it. But the hiring manager said, I hired you because you bring X to the table. And all of a sudden they feel a bit more warmer and a bit more engaged in the organization that they've just started. Hopefully I answered some of that, Danielle.
Sorry, yes, you have answered some of that broadly. Thank you, Scott, because there was a lot of questions in one. We'll just go to final question then before we close. There's quite a few that we've got on sustainability and ESG, but they're quite specific to specific areas. So I think we might take some of those offline. But John, I'd like to finish with a question for you, because you sat there nice and quietly. At school, we were taught the simplest definition of inflation was too much money chasing too few goods. I don't know anyone that has too much money. If inflation is primarily being driven by supply side issues, can restricting the money supply by raising interest rates ever really solve the problem?
The answer to that is twofold. Some of the problem is too much money chasing too few goods. But what we've seen is that there's been too much money in the system for a long, long period of time. But we haven't had inflation because we've had this great manufacturing capacity of China that has allowed us to produce output. We've had wonderful supply chains, which nobody knew anything about because they worked so well prior to COVID. That meant that the global economy could produce output when it was asked to produce output, so we didn't get the inflation that was predicted in that sort of model. Although I would argue we did get some inflation, but it was asset price inflation, and the people who hold assets and who are incredibly wealthy, they like that kind of inflation, and they tend to not shout too loud about reducing it. But that's a story for another day. Okay, I think the problem we got today is that some of the inflation, rather than being too much money chasing too few goods, which is demand side inflation, is cost side. And that's because of the war in Ukraine. It's because of increased food prices, increased fuel prices. It's because of dislocation in supply chains, both COVID and post-COVID, that have caused prices to rise. Okay, and as we recover, my example of European airlines today, where there's a deliberate desire to constrain capacity in order to increase yield and increase profitability. So we're seeing all of these different factors that are influencing inflation, and then we have our central banks who essentially deem themselves to have only one tool, which is higher interest rates. And I'm sure the person who asked the question could go back to their O-level or A-level economics, and they would quite quickly work out that if you drive an economy into recession, it causes prices to go down. But it's not a very clever way of reducing inflation. So short answer is there is an element of too much money chasing too few goods, but it's not all of the story, and therefore we have to have a much more sophisticated response to inflation. And part of that is a lot of what you've been talking about today. It's building robust supply chains, it's building transparent supply chains, it's building supply chains that work. And thankfully, because of all the wrong reasons, supply chains have become much more transparent inside organizations, and we have got a place at the table because of the crisis. And the best statement that I heard anybody say with respect to supply chain in that context is that supply chain for many organizations is not core, but it is critical. If supply chains don't work, their business model collapses, but it's not what they do. And therefore they need procurement professionals, they need supply chain professionals, they need logistics professionals to come in and advise them on how they can make sure that supply chains work effectively and we don't get these inflationary impulses that we've seen. And I'll stop there.
That's a great point to finish on, John. Thank you very much. It just highlights what a great profession we're in, exciting times, lots of challenges, but lots
Absolutely.
of opportunities. And there's been no better time than now to really show the true value of procurement. So, Nick, any final comments from you before I close the session today?
It was just the same thoughts, Danielle. You know, we've had perfect storms that have actually driven the standing, as we've seen, of procurement, both within the profession, but with stakeholders. That's driving a need for different skills across the profession. And Scott talked about the talent and the war on talent and the need for us to have the right education, the right standards. And Nikki's tree example, we really are a function of functions that are offering a diverse set of skill sets around the right tables in the business to help strategic decision making. And at CIPS, we're trying to ensure that we are providing the right standards and ensuring that we have the right training available for people to be able to, wherever they are in their career, ensure they can equip themselves to have those conversations. Because it's like a time we've never had before, and I don't think it's going to get any better or it's going to get any quieter anytime soon. So, and just on behalf of my colleagues here, just a huge thank you to them for their time today.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you, panel. I just want to say thank you so much for giving your time. It's great to have you here, hear your thoughts and diverse